The year was 1943, and the war that had consumed the European continent now stretched its influence across oceans. Ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying not only supplies and troops, but also thousands of prisoners captured on distant battlefields. Among them were German soldiers, many young and weary who had been seized in North Africa or on the Western Front, and now found themselves bound for a land they had only heard of in enemy broadcasts. Imagine the feeling of standing on the deck of a transport ship, watching the endless gray waves, not knowing what awaited on the far shore. For these men, the unknown was filled with fear. Shaped by expectations of retribution from the enemy they had been trained to despise. As the ships approached American ports, the prisoners saw towering cranes, busy docks and guards waiting with rifles. Yet what struck them most was not cruelty, but efficiency and calm. The disembarkation was organized, not chaotic, and the soldiers were marched into waiting trains with a sense of order. Many had expected to be jeered at or beaten, but instead they were watched with firm discipline and silence. Their minds were filled with questions, unable to reconcile this measured reception with the dark images painted by propaganda. The enemy was not screaming with rage, but instead treating them like men to be handled, not monsters to be destroyed. The trains rolled across a country most of them had never imagined in such scale. Through the narrow windows, they glimpsed open fields, small towns, and endless stretches of farmland. For soldiers raised in war-torn Europe, the sight of untouched landscapes and thriving communities was jarring. There was no rubble, no bomb craters, no burnt-out villages. The contrast between the devastation back home and the quiet abundance of America left many in stunned silence. For the first time, they began to realize that captivity might not be the nightmare they had envisioned. When the trains finally slowed and came to a stop, the camps came into view. Rows of wooden barracks stood inside fenced perimeters with guard towers marking the boundaries. At first glance, it was clear that this was no paradise. Yet, as the prisoners were led inside, they saw bunks neatly arranged, kitchens steaming with hot food, and medical stations prepared for those who needed care. It was captivity, but it was also order and structure, a world away from the chaos of the front lines. The first night, many lay awake, wondering if this civility was a facade or if it was truly how the Americans intended to keep them. For those who had grown up under Nazi ideology, the reality of the camp was difficult to process. They had been told again and again that Americans were weak, corrupt, and cruel. Yet here they were, being given blankets, meals, and treatment that was, by many measures, humane. Their minds struggled to reconcile two different worlds, the enemy that propaganda had created and the reality now unfolding around them. It was not freedom, but neither was it the brutality they had feared. Instead, it was something unexpected, something unsettling in its normalcy. In those early days, conversations in the barracks often circled back to the same questions. Why were the Americans treating them like this? What did it mean for the war if their enemy showed such restraint? Some whispered that it was a trick, a tactic meant to break their spirits. Others began to think quietly, unwilling to admit it aloud, that perhaps the enemy was not as monstrous as they had been told. The silence of these thoughts echoed louder than words, shaping the way the prisoners would begin to view their captors. The hook of this story lies in that very tension, the moment when fear began to collide with reality. The German prisoners had entered a new world, one built not on propaganda, but on lived experience. Their journey from battlefield to barracks was more than a change of location. It was the start of an internal battle. In the calm of American camps, with the hum of daily life around them, they would be forced to confront questions they had never dared to ask before. It was here, in the quiet routines of captivity, that the surprising letters would one day be written. The first weeks of captivity revealed a stark conflict between the expectations the German soldiers carried with them and the reality that unfolded inside the American camps. They had prepared themselves for hostility, for hunger, and perhaps even for physical punishment. Instead, they were issued clean uniforms, given 3 meals a day, and treated with a level of respect that was both disarming and confusing. Imagine sitting in a mess hall, the clatter of trays and utensils echoing, while steam rose from plates of food far more plentiful than what many had seen on the front. For men accustomed to scarcity and fear, this abundance felt almost unreal, as if they were inhabiting a dream rather than captivity. The prisoners' disbelief was sharpened by their own memories of how captured enemies had often been treated in Europe. They recalled harsh interrogations, cramped cells, and guards who showed little concern for human dignity. In contrast, the American approach seemed almost lenient. Guards stood watch with authority, but they did not spit insults or strike men down. To a soldier raised in the storm of propaganda that painted Americans as barbaric and vengeful, such behavior was unsettling. It forced them to confront the idea that their worldview, carefully constructed by their leaders, might be flawed. Daily routines inside the camps added to this growing contrast. Prisoners were allowed to work, to read, and even to play soccer or music when the day's duties ended. From behind the wire, they could hear American towns in the distance, the sound of church bells, or the faint whistle of trains carrying goods. These ordinary noises reminded them that life continued peacefully outside, untouched by the war's devastation. Some prisoners began to write letters home describing not cruelty, but unexpected kindness. They tried to capture in words what felt almost impossible to explain, that their enemy had treated them with humanity. Yet not all men accepted this reality with ease. In whispered conversations after lights out, skepticism ran deep. Some insisted that the treatment was a mask, hiding darker intentions that would reveal themselves later. Others feared that too much comfort would make them forget their duty as soldiers of the Reich. The camp became a place of tension, not only between guards and prisoners, but within the prisoners themselves. They were caught between two worlds, the harsh ideology they had been taught, and the contradictory reality unfolding in front of them. The contrast was not only material, but moral. To receive fairness from those they had been told were corrupt struck at the heart of their beliefs. For some, it was easier to dismiss the kindness as weakness, to cling to the narrative that Americans were soft and decadent. For others, it was the beginning of a dangerous thought, that perhaps they had been lied to. In the quiet of the barracks, such realizations were both liberating and frightening. It was a conflict of identity, a battle within the self, as much as a matter of war. Over time, this tension seeped into every aspect of life in the camps. Meals became moments of reflection, guards became silent symbols of contradiction, and even simple medical care seemed to carry meaning beyond its purpose. The longer the prisoners stayed, the harder it became to dismiss what they were experiencing. The Americans were not perfect, but they were not monsters either. This contradiction grew impossible to ignore, creating a slow, grinding conflict in the minds of those who lived through it. The heart of the contrast was this: the prisoners had expected hatred and cruelty, but they found discipline mixed with humanity. It was not the world they had imagined, and it unsettled them deeply. Some fought against it with denial, while others allowed the cracks in their certainty to widen. The clash between ideology and reality would shape not only their letters home, but also the memories that stayed with them long after the war ended. In the stillness of captivity, the battle between propaganda and truth was quietly being fought. The letters that would one day astonish families in Germany began with a simple allowance: the right for prisoners to write home. At first, many German soldiers sat at their small wooden desks in the camp barracks, unsure of what to say. They were given paper, ink, and rules about length and censorship, yet the act of writing was a powerful bridge to the world they had left behind. Imagine the silence of a room filled with dozens of men, each bent over a sheet of paper, their pens scratching slowly as they tried to capture the strange reality of life inside an American camp. What began as a regulated exercise soon became something more, a window into their shifting understanding of the enemy. The content of these letters reflected the shock of captivity. Many described the daily meals with almost reverent detail: bread that was fresh, meat that was plentiful, and coffee that was served hot. Others recounted the medical treatment they had received, care that was given without hesitation even to those who had fought against their captors. They wrote about work details that allowed them to occupy their days, and about guards who, while firm, showed no unnecessary cruelty. To families in bombed-out German cities, these descriptions must have read like fragments from another world. The letters carried not only information but also a sense of disbelief, as if the writers themselves were still adjusting to the reality they described. The origins of this generosity lay in American policy and practice. The United States adhered closely to the Geneva Conventions, ensuring that prisoners were treated in accordance with international law. For the German POWs, this was more than a bureaucratic detail. It was a lived experience that contrasted sharply with what they had seen or heard in Europe. By allowing prisoners to write home, America not only followed the rules, but also gave these men the freedom to communicate truths that might otherwise have been lost. The result was a stream of personal testimonies that revealed more than any official report ever could. In the quiet of the camps, the act of writing became an outlet for reflection. Soldiers who had once marched under banners of ideology now described the sound of music in the evenings, or the fairness of their captors during inspections. Some admitted to confusion, unsure of how to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had always believed. Others remained cautious, careful not to write anything that might be used against them if the letters were intercepted. Yet, even with caution, the tone of humanity seeped through, and their words carried weight far beyond the fences. For families in Germany, the arrival of these letters was a lifeline. They heard the voices of their sons, brothers, or husbands describing captivity in terms that were not filled with despair, but with a strange sort of relief. In a country where food was scarce and destruction surrounded daily life, to hear that a prisoner was eating well and being treated fairly must have felt both comforting and unbelievable. Some may have doubted, dismissing the letters as exaggeration. But others read them again and again, sensing that they revealed cracks in the narrative they had been told. These letters did not emerge in isolation. They were born from the daily rhythms of camp life, from the strange balance of discipline and kindness that characterized American captivity. The origins of the story lie not in grand gestures, but in ordinary acts: a meal served on time, a doctor's visit for a sick man, or a chance to play soccer on an open field. Each of these moments became part of the fabric of the letters, woven into lines that carried across oceans. They were small stories, but they became powerful symbols of something larger. In the end, the origins of these surprising letters were simple yet profound. They were born of a system that valued order, discipline, and a degree of humanity even in the midst of global war. They grew from the hands of men who had been enemies, now reduced to prisoners with time to think and words to share. And they were sent across a continent and an ocean, arriving in homes filled with rubble and uncertainty. Out of this unlikely beginning came a testimony that would shape not only how the war was remembered, but also how humanity was seen in the darkest of times. The battlefield never truly left the minds of the German prisoners, even as they settled into the rhythms of captivity. Night after night, many awoke in their bunks to the echoes of memory, the thunder of artillery, the cries of wounded comrades, the relentless hunger and exhaustion of the front. Against this backdrop of recollection, the relative calm of the American camps was almost surreal. Here, meals were served at regular hours, medical staff treated injuries without hesitation, and guards enforced order without malice. The contrast between those memories of chaos and the reality of camp life became a haunting comparison. It was as if two worlds existed at once, one defined by brutality and the other by discipline and restraint. For the men who had fought through the smoke of North Africa or endured the bitter winters of Europe, captivity was a shock to the senses. Imagine a soldier who had trudged for days through mud and fire, suddenly finding himself sitting in a clean barracks, eating a plate of food, more plentiful than anything he had seen in months. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the steady hum of camp routines. The call to morning roll, the clatter of dishes in the mess hall, the occasional murmur of conversation during work details. It was not freedom, but it was a reprieve, and it forced many to confront questions they had never asked. If their enemy could provide this level of order and humanity, what did that mean for the world they thought they understood? In many ways, the battlefield lingered as a shadow in their letters home. Prisoners described the absence of hunger, the access to medical care, and the strange sense of stability, all set against the horrors they had left behind. These descriptions became unspoken comparisons, subtle acknowledgments that life under the enemy's watch could feel safer than life at the front. For some, this realization was unsettling, almost shameful. They were soldiers of the Reich, meant to embody strength and endurance, yet here they were finding relief in the hands of their captors. The battlefield had prepared them for cruelty, but it had not prepared them for kindness. This shift was not merely personal, it was psychological. The memory of combat had shaped them into men of suspicion and endurance, yet captivity began to reshape those instincts. Every fair interaction with a guard, every hot meal, and every act of medical care stood in opposition to the lessons of war. Slowly, these experiences chipped away at the iron certainty instilled by years of propaganda. On the battlefield, the enemy was faceless and merciless. In the camp, the enemy became human. This change did not erase the memory of combat, but it forced the prisoners to grapple with a new battlefield, one fought within themselves. For the Americans, this treatment was not designed to win affection, but to follow law and order. Yet its impact on the prisoners was profound. The battlefield had taught them that war was merciless, yet captivity revealed another side of the struggle, one defined not by destruction, but by restraint. The two realities collided, leaving the prisoners suspended between what they had seen and what they were now living. It was a collision that many captured in their letters, describing with cautious words the strangeness of being treated not as animals, but as men. The impact was also collective. Around campfires or in dimly lit barracks, men spoke in hushed tones about their shock. Some clung to the belief that this was all a facade, while others began to admit that perhaps they had misjudged their enemy. The battlefield had united them in the belief of superiority, but captivity fractured that certainty. The more they compared the brutality of war with the stability of camp life, the more they struggled to hold on to old convictions. It was as if every act of fairness on American soil was a silent counterattack against the propaganda they had once believed. Ultimately, the battlefield's presence in the minds of the prisoners served as the measuring stick for everything they experienced in captivity. Each meal, each fair inspection, each day without abuse was measured against the hunger, chaos, and fear of combat. And in that comparison, the American camps emerged not as symbols of cruelty, but as unexpected sanctuaries of order. The men who had survived smoke and fire now lived in an environment that forced them to rethink what it meant to be captured and what it meant to face an enemy. This was the battlefield's lingering impact, not in gunfire or strategy, but in the silent reshaping of memory and belief. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of these camp experiences began to stretch far beyond the fences that enclosed the prisoners. Letters written by German soldiers crossed the Atlantic, carrying not tales of cruelty, but accounts of surprising decency. They described meals that were nourishing, medical treatment that was prompt, and guards who behaved with discipline rather than malice. For families in Germany living amid ruins and rationing, such descriptions seem both comforting and bewildering. Imagine opening a fragile envelope in a bombed-out apartment, reading the words of a son who insisted that his American captors were feeding him better than his own army had. The words were startling not only for their content, but for the contradiction they revealed. The wider consequences of these letters lay in the quiet cracks they created in the foundation of Nazi propaganda. The regime had painted the enemy as ruthless and barbaric, Yet here were men who had fought on the front lines insisting that America treated them with fairness. This was not open rebellion, but it was doubt, and doubt could be dangerous. Even if families hesitated to believe entirely, the seed had been planted. If one letter spoke of kindness, could all the stories of hatred truly be trusted? In this way, the correspondence acted as a subtle counter-narrative, quietly undermining the image of an enemy defined only by cruelty. Inside the camps, the consequences were just as significant. For many prisoners, the realization that the Americans were not as they had been taught reshaped daily interactions. Guards became symbols of contradiction, figures who embodied both the role of captor and the unexpected role of humane overseer. The men found themselves looking at their situation differently, no longer as mere victims, but as witnesses to an alternative vision of authority. Some resisted this shift, clinging fiercely to the ideology of the Reich. But others began to change, often in small ways, softening their language, moderating their judgments, and quietly admitting to themselves that the enemy was not as monstrous as they had once believed. These experiences also fostered reflection about their own homeland. In letters, soldiers sometimes compared their conditions in captivity to what they imagined their families endured in Germany. While they ate 3 meals a day, their families survived on rations. While they received medical care without hesitation, civilians at home struggled to find doctors amid bombed-out cities. The irony was striking, and it was not lost on the prisoners. Some felt shame, others relief, but all recognized the disparity between their situation and the suffering of those they loved. In this way, captivity forced them to look not only at the enemy, but also at themselves and the system that had brought them to war. The wider consequences also extended to morale. Among prisoners, there was no single reaction. Some grew restless, angry at what they saw as humiliation, while others grew quietly appreciative of the stability they had been given. Yet together, they could not escape the truth that their captivity was unlike the grim images they had carried in their minds. That realization, spoken aloud in some conversations and hidden in others, reshaped the atmosphere of the camps. It created a strange mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and confusion that left a lasting mark on all who lived through it. Perhaps the most profound consequence was the way these experiences blurred the lines of enemy and ally. Soldiers who had once believed they were locked in an eternal struggle against a merciless foe now saw another side. They did not forget the war, nor the suffering of combat, but they recognized that their captors possessed a moral code that extended even to those who had fought against them. This recognition carried weight, not only in the moment, but in the years to come. The letters they wrote home, filled with cautious yet undeniable truths, became small monuments to this realization. In the end, the wider consequences of the prisoners' experiences were not loud or dramatic, but they were profound. They shifted perceptions, both within the camps and in the homes where letters arrived. They challenged propaganda, created internal conflicts, and laid the groundwork for future reflection. These were not consequences measured in battles or victories, but in hearts and minds, in the slow reshaping of belief. From the barracks of American camps to the bombed-out apartments of Germany, the truth of human decency traveled quietly, leaving behind questions that could not easily be silenced. The climax of this story unfolded not in a single dramatic event, but in a gradual, undeniable shift within the minds of the prisoners. For months, they had struggled to reconcile the propaganda they had been taught with the reality they now lived. At first, many dismissed the decency they encountered as a trick, a temporary mask hiding cruelty. But as the seasons passed and daily life continued with the same steady rhythm, disbelief gave way to reluctant acceptance. The Americans had not revealed some hidden brutality. Instead, they continued to provide food, medical care, and order day after day. For the prisoners, the truth was becoming too consistent to deny. In the letters that crossed the ocean, this acceptance began to emerge with greater clarity. Soldiers wrote not only of meals and discipline, but also of moments that felt deeply personal. They mentioned guards who treated them with courtesy, doctors who listened when they spoke of pain, or the simple relief of lying in a clean bunk after years of hardship. These were not the words of men describing cruelty. They were the words of men who had been forced to admit that their enemy showed them humanity. The tone of disbelief softened into something closer to respect, even if it was not always spoken aloud. This was the turning point, when the conflict between propaganda and reality reached its peak. For some, it was an uncomfortable realization, one that made them question not only their captors, but their own beliefs. To admit that the Americans treated them fairly was to admit that much of what they had been told was false. Imagine the quiet weight of that realization, sitting with pen in hand, knowing that each word written carried with it the power to contradict an entire ideology. In this way, every letter became a small act of reckoning. The climax was also emotional, not just intellectual. Many prisoners felt a kind of inner fracture, torn between loyalty to their homeland and the undeniable experience of decency from their captors. Some resisted, hardening themselves further, refusing to write anything that could betray weakness. But others surrendered to the truth, if not in their politics, then in their private thoughts. In the barracks at night, some admitted quietly that the Americans were not what they had been taught. Such confessions often ended in silence, heavy with the knowledge that these truths were dangerous, but also unavoidable. The power of this climax lay in its subtlety. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no single day when every man suddenly understood. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of evidence: the steady kindness of medical staff, the fairness of guards, the regularity of meals, the absence of abuse. Each small detail built upon the last until the weight of experience outweighed the weight of propaganda. By the time many prisoners picked up their pens to write home, the shift had already happened. They were no longer writing with disbelief, but with recognition. This turning point marked the moment when the letters transformed from simple reports of daily life into testaments of truth. The prisoners had reached a place where they could no longer deny what they had seen and felt. Their enemy had become human, and that humanity was stronger than any story they had been told before. In the context of a world still at war, this realization was extraordinary. It meant that even within the confines of captivity, the human spirit could pierce through the walls of ideology. At its heart, the climax was not about victory or defeat on the battlefield, but about the quiet triumph of reality over falsehood. It was the moment when fear gave way to recognition and suspicion gave way to reluctant respect. The German POWs, who had once braced themselves for cruelty, had instead borne witness to compassion. And in doing so, they had reached the undeniable truth that even in war, humanity could not be silenced. When the war ended and the gates of the camps finally opened, the German prisoners of war began the long journey home. For many, this meant boarding trains once again, crossing landscapes that now seemed different and returning to cities scarred by destruction. Yet as they carried their few belongings, they also carried something less visible but more enduring: the memory of how they had been treated in captivity. These memories were not tales of hunger or cruelty, but of steady meals, fair discipline, and moments of unexpected kindness. The return to Germany was marked by both relief and sorrow, but within the hearts of many former prisoners lingered a quiet acknowledgement of what they had seen in America. The letters they had written during captivity remained behind as fragile testaments. Some families had treasured them, reading and rereading the words of sons, brothers, or husbands who spoke of a reality so different from the ruin around them. Others may have doubted, dismissing the words as exaggeration or censor-approved fabrications. Yet over time, these letters became part of a larger body of evidence that could not easily be dismissed. They documented not just the experiences of individuals, but the moral choices of a nation that had chosen restraint over vengeance. Even decades later, historians would look back on them as small but significant records of humanity in wartime. For the prisoners themselves, the impact of their captivity lingered in complex ways. Some remained loyal to the ideology they had once fought for, unwilling to let their beliefs be challenged. But many others carried with them a changed perspective, one that softened the sharp edges of hatred and replaced it with respect for values they had once mocked. In quiet conversations after the war, some admitted that their first encounters with democracy and fairness had come not through books or speeches, but through the way they had been treated in American camps. These realizations were not universal, but they were real, and they marked the beginning of personal transformations that would ripple into the post-war years. The legacy of these letters and the experiences they reflected did not lie in immediate political change. Rather, it rested in the personal human level of memory and testimony. They served as proof that even in a conflict as vast and brutal as World War II, moments of decency could survive. They demonstrated that humanity could coexist with discipline, that compassion could exist even toward those who had once been enemies. This legacy was quiet, carried not in the headlines of victory, but in the voices of men who had lived through both combat and captivity. In a broader sense, the story of these prisoners and their letters became a symbol of what reconciliation might look like. It suggested that even across the deepest divides, respect could plant seeds of understanding. The camps did not erase the horrors of war, but they showed that war did not have to erase humanity. For many former prisoners, the memory of American kindness was one of the most enduring aspects of their wartime experience. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, people could choose fairness over cruelty. The legacy of these letters still speaks today. They remind us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in the small personal testimonies of those who lived through it. They tell us that propaganda can be broken, not by arguments alone, but by lived truth. And they prove that the choices made in moments of power, even in how one treats a captive enemy, can echo for generations. In the end, the story of the surprising letters written by German prisoners of war is not only a tale of the past, but also a lesson for the future. It teaches that kindness, even when unexpected, can transcend enmity and reshape memory. It shows that the quiet strength of humanity can survive even amid global conflict. And it leaves us with the reminder that long after the war has ended, the legacy of compassion can outlive the noise of battle.